life as the one time I went to a con in Tennessee and tried to do a survey, and they made fun of me for a good 45 minutes straight, and I drank more than I had in a very long time then. So I don't do surveys and interviews of hackers anymore because it's just not really worth it in the end. The info that I get isn't really the same as the info you can get from other sources. But that actually raises a good point for what will come up in what I have for you today, is that data's great, data's good, data comes from all kinds of places, but at the end of the day, the data that you get is only as good as certain elements of it. And as a criminologist, I've been studying cybercrime since about 2003. I look at hacking, I look at really anything and everything online. And I've studied police responses to different types of cybercrime, individual offending, victimization. I do a lot of different work. And coming from the social science perspective, we get a lot of, oh sorry, I didn't want to project too much. We get a lot of different perspectives on behavior relative to what you see in, say, perhaps computer science, where there's a much heavier focus on methods and tactics for defense or disruption. Coming from the social sciences, we're more interested in understanding behavioral, psychological, social, economic drivers. And that's helpful. But one of the things that we don't do as a field is look at individual motivation. Motivation is largely treated as a constant. So a person is going to do some activity because they want or they need whatever is involved. And that's not necessarily helpful. Sure, somebody may need money, they may need sexual gratification. There's any number of different inherent drivers for action, and there can be multiple at the same time. But that doesn't necessarily help us at the end of the day either. So the little bit of work that people have done approaches it either from the perspective of crime as being instrumental, which would be economic in nature, or expressive. And on the instrumental side, there's tons of work looking at burglary, at robbery, drug dealing. These are all behaviors that generate immediate revenue. The expressive side tends to focus more on violence as an expression of some individual belief. And so that could be a racist ideology, that could be a need for revenge, feeling wronged, that sort of crime of passion type idea, or it can be things that are more mundane, like vandalism, trying to express your ideas, yourself in some fashion. And coming from that perspective is helpful because it at least gives us a way to think about certain types of cybercrime. When we talk about hacking in particular, we can bin certain actors' motivations into buckets. If we think about, say, the nation-state side, there's largely going to be more of that expressive interest. There can be economic incentives there as well, but most nation-state actions seem to be fixated on gaining information either for economic advantage over a country or to cause direct harm. All you need to do is look at Ukraine and Russia right now and you can see all sorts of different expressive hacking behaviors, whether in an attempt to cause damage or to disrupt action. When we think about the non-nation state side, though, that's when we expect more instrumental motivation, this need to make money, but you can see elements of expression in there as well. On the non-nation state side, I'm sure you're all very familiar with all the different ways that you can make money in the underground, whether it's selling exploits on the dark web, whether it's running a booter and stressor service. Anybody ever familiarize themselves with the booter and stressor community? Okay. If you are familiar, it's cheap, it's efficient, it's a very effective way to do DDoS very quickly, and the pricing is fantastic if you're the operator. We're trying to do some estimates right now to look at how much vendors are making, but if you look at and take DOJ estimates or some European government estimates, vendors are making hundreds of thousands of dollars if they're good, which is a great rate of return for general behavior. And it makes sense. If you can knock a service offline, people are going to pay you well for it. But then there's all the bland kind of sale of stolen data that's out there. I'm sure you're all familiar with carding markets and different fora to go to buy credit cards and any other number of tools. This is one of my favorites, Mecha Dumps, because they give you such an easy and crisp interface, and their deposit system works really well. And their tutorial is unparalleled. It is so effective, it makes my undergrads understand exactly how to buy and sell data, which is great. From a social science perspective, we understand a lot about the economic drivers for certain forms of cybercrime and hacking. There's lots and lots of research looking at the markets, looking at certain types of hacking, but what we really don't do well, and I think this is kind of inherently true of the entire space around cybersecurity and practice, is understand the ideological component of it. We know quite a bit about why people hack for profit. We know far less about why they do it for some other reason. And there's some historical bits and pieces that you can point to. As a sort of discipline in criminology, we grew a lot in the early 2000s into the mid-2000s, and now we've got this robust area of study around economic crime. But there's way less of that when it comes to the general understanding around ideological cyber. Even thinking about nation-state activities, there's 5 or 6 studies that I can point to that actually use data to understand why nation-state hacks are happening, or even what their scope is like. It's far, far fewer, and there's little real quantitative data. If you're familiar with the idea of quantitative versus qualitative, one being heavy data-driven analysis and statistics, the other side being more interview-based, we really don't have much of either, but what we do have tells us just a little bit about what people do. And we're now at a point in time where if we look at, say, ideological violence in physical space, there's a ton of social scientists, political scientists, different disciplines, all looking at why people perform acts of violence for an ideological cause. We know quite well whether it's on the jihadi end of the spectrum or racial and ethnically motivated violence. We know lots about that, but we don't know as much really about what happens in cyberspace. And it's a question that merits some consideration. I'm sure you can think of a few examples over the last couple of years of cyber attacks that have happened for some ideological purpose. But we don't know in real hard numbers what that looks like. So what I wanted to do today is kind of walk you through what we've been able to find and just give some historical background for what we know about the ideological space in general. One of the earliest examples, and some of you may be familiar with this, is the Electronic Disturbance Theater. They were one of the first groups in the mid to late 90s that was interested in hacking for a cause. And they came at it more from an artistic point of view. At the time, they were interested in how do we use virtual space to engage in sit-ins and to protest activities in a way that might be meaningful. And so they targeted the Pentagon initially and just used DDoS as a tool for virtual sit-ins, basically making a resource unusable. And they used a tool called FloodNet, which is like a forerunner to the low-orbit ion cannon. Basically, you download it, it will do most of the attack for you, you just have to know when to push the button to go. Very easy to use tool and very effective. But the Electronic Disturbance Theater didn't really last that long. They disbanded in the early 2000s, and people still talk about it. Members of the theater themselves, you can find interviews of them online. But they're not nearly as active or as interested in activity as they were then. From there, in the mid-2000s, the early to mid-2000s, we saw this rise of Turkish hackers. And this is an especially interesting one because it ties into what we know about real-world action as well. If you're familiar at all with some of the massive web defacements that took place in the mid-2000s, a lot of it was driven by the publication of an image of Muhammad, a cartoon in a publication called Charlie Hebdo, which was very offensive to the Muslim community. And so Turkish hackers in particular, since it's a Muslim majority nation, started taking an interest in and defacing different websites and companies that supported Charlie Hebdo. And they went at it with real gusto, targeting thousands and thousands of sites, to the point where some Turkish hackers were viewed as a major threat in the United States because of their ability to easily target resources and generate some attention. Has anybody ever heard of a hacker called Iskorpits? He was a very prolific defacer and is thought to be a Turkish mathematician. And he just liked to hack, and he would post YouTube tutorials on how to use different vulnerabilities to hack. And most of their hacks were because of their religious beliefs. And from there, they started to pivot more toward nationalistic hacks. So if you were affecting the operations of Turkey or were in some way disparaging the country, they would engage in targeted attacks against your nation. From there, we can easily see the transition from Turkish defacers and kind of this electronic disturbance theater idea into Anonymous. And I'm sure everybody in here is familiar with Anonymous, right? Raise your hand if you haven't heard of Anonymous. Perfect. So this I don't really need to go into any depth on. We all know Anonymous comes together for whatever reason, targets whatever. They hit the Church of Scientology, PayPal, virtually anything that you can think of. And then disbanded after the whole H.B. Gary thing, or at least major arrests caused some key members of different aspects of Anonymous to go away for a while. And we've seen subsequent attacks by Anonymous or Anonymous-like groups over the last couple of years. Blue Leaks, if you're familiar with that, just a couple of years ago, where multiple police agencies had data stolen and then leaked online, all because of the rise in racial and ethnically targeted violence by the police against different communities. So there's this set of examples that we can point to about different types of cyber activity. But we don't know anything in crystal clear reasons how often different ideological attacks occur or what they mean in practice. So myself and some colleagues have tried to build data sets to do this. One of the things that we tried to do, for instance, was to take data from Zone H. Anybody familiar with Zone H? Okay. If you aren't familiar, Zone H is a huge repository of web defacements. And they will give you access to their data. From an academic perspective, it was expensive in order to get access to data. And so we were only able to get a small slice bit. But using about 2.2 million defacements from just those against the US IP space from 2012 to 2017, we were able to see what attacks were performed for what reason. Now, admittedly, since it's a global database for reporting, not every respondent, when they go to report their defacement, is necessarily an English speaker. And they're given a forced choice set of responses for lots of different things. One of the things that they can report is why they performed the defacement. And so we took that as a variable. And they note, did you do this for a political reason or a patriotic reason? So we binned those two responses together. And that gives us about 9% of all the defacements in our data set. So we collapsed those together into a single measure. So basically, did you do this for some ideological purpose or not? And we applied a framework called routine activities theory, which is popular in criminology as a way to understand why people do different things and what they target. And taking that information, we were then able to do a logistic regression. So basically controlling for ideological cause, what do these incidents look like? If I perform a defacement for an ideological reason, how does that differ relative to all others in our set? And we found that the ideological actors were more likely to target home pages of websites, and for some reason were more likely to go after .edus relative to all other domains that we have in the data, which was a little surprising to me. I was expecting we might see some more .govs or other resources in there, but nope, those weren't significant. They were also more likely to target foreign TLDs. So that could be a .edu.au, for instance, or whatever other country that might be in the top-level domain component. So being a foreign TLD was also a significant factor. We also found they were more likely to do single defacements rather than mass defacements, which, if you're familiar, mass defacement, that's where you take everything down. A single defacement is where you just do one page. So there's something distinctive about that as a predictor for the ideological actor. And they were more likely to target Linux servers, which realistically that's not that helpful of a measure. Most everything is Linux-based, right? There's some Microsoft servers, some Apple servers, but Linux in particular was a big predictor there. They were also more likely to use unknown vulnerabilities and less likely to use SQL injection and known vulnerabilities. So there's something about their methodology as well. The capacity for use of unknown vulnerabilities to deface is a somewhat interesting feature of these attacks. So that gave us a basis to say, all right, there's something here. Let's dig further. And what we don't know is more crystalline activities beyond defacements. We understand people want to engage in different attacks. We know there's interest in harming infrastructure. If you go back to the early 2000s, shortly after 9/11, there was a jihadi manual published online called The 39 Ways to Jihad. And one of the ways that they note in this writing is the importance of engaging in cyber attacks, because you can cripple the West more effectively online than you can by trying to engage in physical activity. Your risk is reduced, your potential for economic harm is greater, so go there. And in general, we know there's more resources, there's more targets, there's less risk overall. So going after online infrastructure makes sense for the ideological actor. But we don't really know anything. If you look at terrorism research at all, or you're interested in ideological violence, you can find tons and tons of open repositories for data. There's this one called the GTD, or the Global Terrorism Database. And they have thousands of incidents recorded around the world, but they don't capture cyber. And the same is true for data sets like PIRUS and other data sets like the ECDB, or the Extremist Crime Database. So if nobody's capturing cyber, but they are capturing physical activity, myself and some colleagues tried to develop our own data set. And we utilized open source metrics to do this, to create what we refer to as the Extremist Cybercrime Database. And this is what our decision tree looks like for capturing incidents. So basically we go through every open port that we can think of in terms of public reporting. Is it a traditional media print source? Is it a cybersecurity blog or website? Is it something like the Hacker News? Everything that we can find online that might tell us information about a cyber attack that occurred for an ideological or expressive cause. So we capture everything happening after 1998. And that is a little bit of an arbitrary date, but that struck us as the best point to start. There may have been things before that, but most of the world's online in 1998, so it's a reasonable point to begin data collection. We also fixed our focus on the United States to start. We do have some incidents that go against the UK and other places, but our primary interest is on targeting the United States or resources within it. And then was the attack performed by either a nation state or a non-nation state actor? Sometimes that's really clear, sometimes it's not, but it's just a way for us to differentiate behavior. And if you have questions as I'm going, feel free to stop me. I'm just giving you some general background on how we set things up. So if it's performed for an ideological cause, what are the ideologies? And in the general universe of research on ideological violence, phrasing like far right, far left used to be common. We've shifted that terminology, and now the focus is more on racial and ethnically motivated action, or animal, earth liberation causes, things like that. So the terminology you see here is a little bit dated at this point, but it is still reflective of kind of common ideological beliefs in general. And so if the incident fits into either the nation state or the non-nation state buckets, what kinds of attacks were used? So our initial focus was on DDoS, on data breaches, web defacements, kind of public-facing behaviors, but also doxing if it required some kind of hack or some other means to acquire the information and then post it publicly. And we also include things that fall into a kind of other category, like spam emails or hacking social media, or even strobing GIF spamming, which I know that sounds unusual, but there are some incidents that have happened where ideological actors have used strobing GIFs as a way to target different groups, such as Epilepsy Foundation resources, which you can imagine is a terrible thing to do, given that can trigger seizures. So all these incidents fall into what we would consider to be some type of cybercrime performed for an ideological cause. So if it meets all these criteria, we code those cases. And in doing so, it's given us a lot of information. Not as much as we were hoping for, but it at least gives us a starting point. So taking that information, I'm going to show you some preliminary information that we have from the Extremist Cybercrime Database. And I'm just going to present some of the more overt ideological attacks that we have. To be honest, Anonymous is the primary actor set in our data, but they don't align to any one poll. So we can't say that Anonymous fits into the environmental or animal, or the racial or ethnically motivated, or even the jihadi categories. They kind of fall into different buckets depending on what activity you're looking at. So I'm just going to focus on those that are most clearly aligned with an ideological cause for now. And you can see different trajectories depending on which actor set we're looking at. So for the jihadi and the environmental or animal groups, they're the most active in our set with 18 incidents total. But that's really not much. That's a drop in the bucket by comparison to, say, data breaches or any other normal kind of economic driver cybercrime activity. And we also see some interesting parallels to real-world action. If you look at the jihadi category, for instance, 2015 is the most prolific year for jihadists in our data set, which aligns to general activity of ISIS in physical space. The rise of ISIS in real-world action aligns with what we see in cyberspace. And then there's a pretty dramatic drop-off after that. We see that the environmental and animal groups are a little more consistently active over time. And one of the most interesting things from my perspective, at least, is that this rise in consistency in cyber activity is taking place in a time where they have engaged in virtually no physical action whatsoever. In the early to mid-2000s, there was a general decline in animal and environmental groups' physical activities. So say whether it's firebombing clinics or releasing animals from farms or trying to damage construction equipment, all that stuff has dropped off. And in 2009, DHS put out a brief saying, we think that we're going to see environmental and animal groups move to online spaces. They don't really have a good rationale for it. It's just a general expectation. And our data proves that out. When you compare it to, say, some of the other open repositories for data on these groups, they don't act in physical space anymore, but they are in cyberspace, which is interesting, if nothing else, because it shows that there's this switchover in interest and activity. Then lastly, we have our racial and ethnically motivated category. And unfortunately, most of their actions take place after 2016, which aligns to what we've seen as a rise again in groups that are interested in causing harm on the basis of racial or ethnic differences, that kind of white nationalist ideology is happening in cyberspace, but at much lower rates by comparison to these other two categories. And if we break out the types of incidents that they engage in, we see a lot of attacks happening in parallel. So it's not just one activity, it can be multiples happening at the same time. And we code for every one of these incidents in our data file, regardless of how many total events occur. So we have 67 different types of attacks, even though we have a much smaller number of total incidents, which is helpful. That means that they're targeting multiple entities. They may be defacing a target and engaging in a data breach simultaneously. And most of the incidents are either defacements or doxing, but we do have a number of data breaches, which tells us that there's some interest in making a very clear and visible type of attack, like a defacement, something where you can clearly show this is us, this is what we've done. If we look at the target set as well, this is instructive because it tells us who the actors are going to go after. And for our animal and earth focused groups, they're more likely to target businesses and individuals, which aligns to what we typically know about their actions in physical space. The racial and ethnically motivated groups, however, were more likely to target educational institutions and then businesses and individuals and other targets. When we look at traditional racial and ethnically motivated groups' activities in physical space, they're more likely to go after persons, so just individuals based on their racial or ethnic identity, and police officers. So there's a much different breakdown in virtual space as opposed to physical space. And our jihadi actors were going after pretty much anything. So there's a much different set of targets for the jihadi groups by comparison to, say, the animal and earth and the racial and ethnically motivated groups. So with all that out of the way, I want to give you some examples so you know more of what I'm talking about. But some of the things that I'm going to show can be triggering. This is all information that's based on open reporting, and so there might be some images or some content here that could be offensive, and I'm not intending to do so. It's just as a means of giving you a demonstration of what people are actually doing when it comes to these groups. So just a heads up here. And I'll start by walking through the racial and ethnically motivated group activities because it helps to show kind of where these actors are at and what they're doing. And on the racial and ethnically motivated side, one of the most unusual incidents we have in our data set was an actor who targeted college campuses. Basically, any open wireless printer was targeted and sent this message and just told to repeat and print until the printer ran out. And apparently about 5,000 campuses were affected across the entire United States. And the actor responsible says, I didn't really hack this at all. They were just open. There was no vulnerability involved. It didn't compromise any network, so I just found these printers and just had them print. And if you're familiar at all with sort of far-right ideologies or racial and ethnically motivated groups, this happened in 2016, and that's when most of the reporting came out. The site and the printing image that you see here is what came out. And they were supporting a site called the Daily Stormer. The Daily Stormer was involved in and helped to facilitate some of the Unite the Right protests in Charlottesville, Virginia that led to violence and physical harm. The actor responsible for this hack also acts as basically tech support for the group and for other racial and ethnically motivated groups generally. Yeah? Not to my knowledge. I think he's still somewhere in Eastern Europe or Russia, but I could be wrong. Yeah, the actor responsible for this is a guy named Weave, and I'll talk a little bit more about him later. He's very public, or at least he was at different points in time. And this kind of activity actually fits with some of the other incidents we see. They aren't technically complex hacks. One of the other things that we have are spamming campaigns, one of which targeted University of Michigan websites. Now, thankfully, I'm at Michigan State. We haven't had this yet. But multiple universities across the country reported getting spam from different racial and ethnically motivated groups. Whether this was to annoy or harass or intimidate, doesn't really matter. The point is just to get people aware of what their message is. And it all fits into a general campaign of what we know about activities of white nationalists and other racial and ethnically motivated groups. Along those lines, one of the other ones was the targeting of Leslie Jones, an actress. She was in the Ghostbusters movie that came out in like 2016. White nationalists and other racial and ethnically motivated actors targeted her website. They published her nudes. They doxed the hell out of her. It was really vicious, and all because of her race and her performance in a movie. And this is the kind of activity that we're talking about. Not technically proficient, not these sophisticated fancy hacks, but incidents performed based on the target and their potential for kind of visibility within this community. By comparison, when we look at, say, the jihadi incidents that we have, their targets and their activities fit more into a desire to generate attention and to cause harm. One of the simplest examples that we have is when members of the Cyber Caliphate, one of ISIS's hacking teams, compromised the Twitter account for U.S. Central Command and then started posting under that account and changing all the content. So not sophisticated necessarily, but certainly embarrassing. And a few others where they were defacing websites across the United States. For instance, the Department of Corrections for the state of Ohio. And so they posted this message, "We love ISIS, I love the Islamic State," and you were hacked by Team System DZ. So some defacement crews associated with jihadi groups did this on the basis of drawing attention to their cause. This isn't necessarily, like hacking the White House, but it's still trying to get attention by going after high visibility targets. And if you compare this to the animal and earth liberation groups that we have in our data set, their attacks are very, very different. And the animal and earth groups tend to go after higher visibility targets with the intent to embarrass and shame, kind of like ISIS. But some of their incidents, for example, include targeting the National Agriculture Laboratory. So they dumped all the usernames and passwords that they could get for internal systems and just put it online. They also targeted Monsanto and other industries because of their potential to cause harm to the environment or to harm animals. And one of the other things that we have in here is very direct targeting of farms and agriculture producers, which I don't know if any of you work with ag businesses in general, but cybersecurity isn't necessarily at the forefront of some farm industries. And when you talk about this as a potential, it's eye-opening. For example, this company, the Hudson Valley Foie Gras producer, if you know anything about the production of foie gras, it requires you to overfeed the animal and cause their liver to swell. It's thought to be a very cruel farming practice. And the individuals associated with one group got access to their customer database and then just posted it online saying this person used their American Express card to buy this, and just on and on and on. This is information that could be monetized in some fashion, but they're not doing this to, say, sell the cards to make money. It's just simply, we want to embarrass the company and their customers. And one of the pieces of information we were able to find was an interview with one of the farmers who was compromised. And their response was, well, yeah, everybody gets hacked, and so now it's just our turn. Not, oh, we're sorry for our customers, or we got attacked because of this, just simply, yeah, everybody gets hacked. Which isn't maybe what you want to hear if your data is lost in a breach, but it points to some things that we can think about in terms of ideology and hacking risk in general. This is another instance where we have both the Animal Liberation Front and Anonymous working in tandem, which is kind of unusual. We didn't expect there to be these overlaps in group interests. But this was the image of the defacement that the attackers performed, and it was against a fur and leather company. And so they hacked the website, and then they dumped all the customer data online and put it on Pastebin. Again, information that could be easily sold. No interest in doing that on the part of the attackers, just simply posting it and trying to embarrass the customers and the company. And then one of the other things that we've noted are animal and earth liberation motivated actors doxing people. This you may be familiar with, where an individual who got a license to hunt a black rhino was then doxed online. And this aligns in some respects with Anonymous, where they were engaging in op, fun, kill, trying to embarrass people who were getting hunting licenses. So a lot of different activity and different foci depending on the interest of the actor group. Now, one of the things that we're trying to do is better understand who these actors are. How does somebody go from being a hacker and then being an ideological hacker? Or how does it really start? Is it that you're an ideologist to begin with and then you become a hacker? We're trying to piece some of that out. And this is Weave. This is the individual who who sent that wireless printer hack message. If you're familiar with Weave's story at all, kind of a griefer in the mid to late 2000s, then hacked AT&T. And I'm using hacked in quotes here because he basically manipulated URLs in the AT&T website till he got it to produce customer records. Only about 300 total usernames and passwords who were AT&T clients. But it was enough to draw attention, and he's a big attention hog, and so he went to the press and was talking about how he hacked AT&T, and there's him wearing an AT&T hat because he hacked AT&T, and eventually he was arrested and he was prosecuted federally, and he wound up in prison. Now this is him before. This is him post-release from federal prison. That gigantic swastika tattoo he got while or after he was released. And he mentions, he had a podcast for a while, and he talks about his radicalization while in prison. And that is somewhat interesting because if you know the radicalization literature at all around traditional acts of violence, prison can be a place where individuals have racial awakenings, or at least where ideological motivation can take root. And so if this is accurate, it tells us something about a risk point for ideological and sort of intrinsic connection between hacking and ideological hacking. And I mentioned he's the person responsible for this hack. he still, or at least for a period of time, was offering support to the Daily Stormer. The Daily Stormer's website was eventually taken down post-Charlottesville, and now you can try to find them, but it's not very easy. They were on the dark web for a while. Their hosting goes up and down, but they've kind of been relegated to the dustbin of racial and ethnically motivated groups. Regardless, he's an interesting example of an ideological hacker. Another one that we have is an individual named Ardit Farizi, and he was born in Kosovo during the war in the 1990s. He engaged in a hack against an Illinois-based government contractor and was able to acquire sensitive information about individuals working for this company, many of whom were government contractors. And then he dumped all this data on Twitter directly to the Islamic State's Twitter account in the hopes of helping them to develop a kill list for physical space. When he was arrested, he was picked up in Malaysia, and he was eventually extradited to the U.S., and he's now in federal prison. But to learn a little bit of his life history, he was born in Kosovo during the war. He is a Muslim, and he viewed the way in which the Muslim community was being treated, particularly around the time of the rise of ISIS, as a problem. He'd been a very good defacer in his teens, and he knew how to hack, and the more he was reading online and the more he was being eventually sort of indoctrinated into a jihadi perspective, the more he was willing to use his skills to hack on behalf of an ideological cause. And so while he was never imprisoned, he began to radicalize, similar to what you see now about, say, like lone wolf shooters, where they read manifestos, materials online, and eventually come to accept that ideology. So he's another one of the limited examples we have. I say limited only because of the incidents we have, we really don't know that much about the people responsible. Mostly it's just handles. Very few, if any, of the people in our data set are ever arrested. Weave is really one of the only examples, as is this person, Ardit Farizi. There's a third that I can talk about, and this is Junaid Hussain. Junaid Hussain was a major component of the ISIS cyber caliphate for a period of time. He was born in the UK, he was a Muslim, he was a very good hacker, and he hacked, it was either a member of the royal family or some part of the UK government. And in doing so, he was eventually imprisoned for those hacks. And while in prison, he radicalized to violence. So this is him before being incarcerated on the left, and then that's him post-incarceration. Once he was released, he eventually sort of cut ties with his family, with his legitimate, I'll use that in quotes, legitimate hacker friends, and decided he was going to travel abroad and engage in material support for ISIS. He was eventually killed in a drone strike as part of the general war on terror. But that gives you a sense of some ways that these individuals align. We know that radicalization happens. Ardit Farizi is an excellent example of that. Those who are arrested appear to radicalize further while incarcerated, which aligns with what we know about traditional terrorism offline or extremism in offline spaces. And they also engaged in some kind of material support activities. So it's not just that they hack, it's that they're also offering tech support for long-term gain, which is important because if this becomes a major space for actors, then we need to be more cognizant of how they come to these actions. One thing to note, though, we only have the racial and the jihadi groups represented here. The animal and earth groups that we have in our data set, nobody's been arrested for these activities. They're prolific, they're at least high visibility, but no one ever gets arrested. So there's some good degree of anonymity on the part of these actors. I know I've got till noon, so I'm just going to quickly run you through a couple of examples that we have on the nation-state side. So we don't have much in terms of great detail about the actors involved, but one thing that we've also got in our data is about 47% of all incidents aligning to nation-states. And some of these are very simple, like web defacements occurring after the execution, if you want to think of it as that, or the death of Qassem Soleimani, an Iranian general, in the late 2020 period. So he was killed. A couple of Iranian hackers started engaging in web defacements against the U.S., and it turns out they had some degree of state support. That's very simple, right? When we think about most nation-state hacks, you're probably thinking of the biggies, the Cozy Bears and Lazy Bears, or any of the Chinese or North Korean groups that are out there. And certainly they are very effective. They're good. You've got some familiarity with their activities. You may not know all of them, though. There's an interesting case that we have, for instance, where Iranian nationals tried to hack a dam in upstate New York. Thankfully, it didn't work, but you can imagine the harm that could result if individuals are able to compromise critical infrastructure and cause, say, a flood, or compromise water production or sanitation or any other aspects of our necessary critical infrastructure for survival. Instead, you're probably more familiar with things like WannaCry, the North Korean ransomware, or perhaps the OPM hack, which is thought to have been caused by Chinese nationals. If you're not familiar with this one, major loss of sensitive information. The Office of Personnel Management maintains all of the security clearance records for federal employees and those who are even tangentially associated with the federal government. I had a clearance for a little while, and all my stuff was lost in the OPM hack, which is just really, really staggering. And so thanks, China. So most of those activities correspond to the APT41 group. And increasingly, countries are at a loss as to how to name and shame or how to effectively deter nation-state hackers. If we see that the average non-nation-state person isn't arrested, well, what do you do when they're military supported or they're federally supported and they're in China or Russia where we have no extradition potential? So the worst that we can do is name them, talk about them, maybe try to prosecute without the person, but it's not going to generate anything in terms of real practice. So going through the data that we have within our set of incidents, we've got about 100 that align to nation states. And most of these are performed involving either data breaches or in some way leading to the creation and release of malware to facilitate the attack. Of all the incidents that we have, defacements, denial of service, the things that we would think of more with the simplistic kinds of hacks aren't in there. It's far more focused on, say, federal government resources, businesses, major businesses at that, and trying to steal sensitive information. We're working on analyzing the data that we have now and comparing the nation-state actors to the non-nation state. And what we've been able to see so far is that, yes, they are less likely to involve simple forms of attack, they're more likely to involve data breaches, they're more likely to involve malware, and they're more likely to be linked. So you have multiple entities being targeted, and it's all persistent over time to that group or to those actors. And they're more likely to target state governments, and this is a sort of statistical significance question. They're more likely to target state governments and military organizations by comparison to our non-nation state actors. So slightly different, but still in line with what we see from just general media reporting. So it's helpful, and it at least gives us some direction for what can happen next. And that's a great question, right? What's going to happen next? You're all familiar with SolarWinds, the major hack in 2020. Are you familiar with the use of Chinese malware embedded in tax software before that? It's an excellent forerunner to what we see with SolarWinds. So in 2018, the use of trusted software, a trusted platform to then inject and engage in major loss. But that's true with SolarWinds. Really, it's true with NotPetya. You can look at all kinds of examples where trusted platforms are now being abused. So hopefully this was interesting. Hopefully it just pointed out some things that we're seeing and some issues that you might not have thought of. So to summarize, ideological actors are active in online spaces, but it's not nearly to the degree as other traditional economic forms of cybercrime. The racial and ethnically motivated groups aren't really sophisticated. The animal and earth ones are more sophisticated and far more persistent over time. We may expect racial and ethnically motivated actors to increase, particularly depending on what happens over the next few years. But we've seen this downturn in jihadi behavior. Maybe that will continue, maybe not. We're still looking at it. And that our nation-state actors are more complex, more sophisticated, but the lack of information in our data set, we don't want to say that we have all the information. All that I can say is that the information we have is from public reporting. there's probably scads of attacks that we're never going to see. If your company has gotten spam from racial or ethnically motivated groups, unless it hits a traditional media source or the person is arrested, we won't see that. And so we probably only have a drop in the bucket of what the reality of all these incidents are. And the same is true for the nation state side. There's attacks that we'll never know about just based on the target or the degree of visibility around the reporting. What we are trying to do more of, though, is understand the radicalization process as well. Are you a hacker first and then an ideologue second? Or what are the triggering points for radicalization to ideological cyber attack? And then how might those individuals be deterred over time? One of the other things that we're interested in looking at, and we'll probably need to do more of, is how these incidents may evolve as we move into the next election cycle. Obviously, the next couple of years are going to be very busy politically, and what might that mean for the kinds of attacks that we might observe, and what kinds of pivots might we see from different groups. An excellent example of that is you may have remembered briefly a flap where individuals in Florida and I believe Alaska were claiming that they were getting emails from the Proud Boys threatening them about how they should vote. And initially some people thought, wow, the Proud Boys are sending spam emails? Now this turned out to be nation state sponsored, I believe coming out of Iran. But the fact that they were able to utilize an ideological group as the cover for this incident really tells you a lot about where we are. That nation states are savvy about what actor groups are active in what spaces. And so this is something that we really need to be mindful of moving forward. How are people going to hide what they're doing in real time? So with that, I'll open it up for questions, and thank you all for having me. If anything you want to ask later offline, you can hit me up via email or Twitter. Happy to hear from you.